This further is Siyaduma Beniza, who's the Executive Director at Political Economy Southern Africa. Thank you for making time for us, Mr. Beniza. What does the admission of the African Union as a permanent member of the G20 mean for this continent? How does it strengthen the voice of the Global South?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Clement. Look, I think it's a positive thing that the African Union has been included in this grouping. However, I think we cannot really divorce this move by G20 from the ongoing geopolitical tensions between the so-called West, which is led by the United States and the European Union essentially, and against the East, so-called China and Russia bloc, which also includes BRICS. And so, although this is a positive move, some might be asking, what is one to make of other blocs and other areas of the economy in the Global South, such as Latin American countries who have no representation, or even Asian countries, their groupings such as ASEAN, who also represent a significant proportion of the global population who aren't represented in the G20 except through the nation states that are permanent members of the G20. And so, although it is a positive move and in inclusive direction, however, I cannot divorce it from the ongoing geopolitics, and I think the interests of the United States, given that the bloc, if it were to vote as a bloc on some of the issues at the United Nations, represents a significant proportion of over 54 votes within the context of multilateral decision-making globally. Yeah. So that's really my view on this matter.
There are those who argue that the AU has been relatively sort of inward-looking. So does joining this global forum present any political, cultural, or perhaps even technical challenges for the AU?
I think most definitely. I think already the AU is inundated with domestic issues. If it's not some country issues that are creating challenges for the AU, but also its own funding and being able to respond to some of these things. For a long time, some people have criticized the AU for being largely a talk shop that isn't able to deal with some of the pressing challenges that the continent faces now, such as unconstitutional changes in government that we've seen across various regions in West Africa as well as Central Africa, such as the issue of climate change and the impact that it has on livelihoods on the continent. So the other thing is, what will its positive contribution be in the context of G20, given that most African countries have been largely recipients of the so-called benefits or beneficiations from the G20, such as the debt service suspension initiative that occurred over the last 2 years post the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is really raising a lot of issues to House as to, is the African Union House in order such that it can contribute to global geopolitics? And if it cannot resolve its own domestic and sort of continental issues here, it's very little, it can only contribute very little in the context of global multilateralism in this context.
Okay. So we obviously have to acknowledge how big a moment this is, the momentum for Africa's representation, in these formal and informal global governance forums. And one wonders what it means for the United Nations Security Council and that plea for a permanent member seat on that council.
Look, I don't think that we're going to see much change in terms of the United Nations Security Council reforms. Although African countries have been at the forefront of calling for these institutions to be reformed, those in control and the veto members, the P5, seem to be taking a different view on topical issues depending on where their interests lie. For example, although the African Union has now been admitted into the G20 as a permanent member, in other groupings, countries like the United States and the European Union, which are leading, such as NATO, over the last 2 years, despite the conflict and the promises to fast-track Ukraine's ascension into NATO, that hasn't happened. Similarly, all the guys by the African Union and African leaders to reform the United Nations Security Council have not been taken up. There is only sort of one compromise that has been taken in terms of the rotational permanent seat from the Global South countries, but I don't think that that's going to have any significant, meaningful change in terms of how multilateralism runs and the balancing, the bargaining power of the Global South within these global institutions.
Do you think, though, that the AU and its member states are ready to meaningfully participate in the G20, where collective solutions to the world's economic and development challenges and not just Africa's problems are actually discussed? Because I imagine we must have a clear position on a number of world issues, even on issues that the AU hasn't really focused on before because they don't directly, relate to Africa. I mean, I imagine a stance perhaps on North Korea's nuclear program, for instance. Are we ready for that meaningful participation?
I think this is precisely part of the problem. I don't think many African states have a clear view on some of these global geopolitical issues. Take, for example, the issue of the Ukraine conflict. Even in the context of the UN, the votes were divided. Some countries condemning the war. In fact, very few were actually condemning the war, and some sitting on the fence and deciding not to vote. And I think what's more important is, being a grouping of what was originally a grouping of central bank governors and ministers of finance targeting reforms of the global financial architecture. It'll be interesting whether the African Union can make a meaningful impact there on some of the issues that we've been calling for, such as, debt cancellations, debt relief for a lot of African countries who are burdened by sort of pre-colonial or colonial debts, and at the same time bring in to the forefront new issues such as domestic currency lending, which we've been calling for in all the Bretton Woods institutions, which hasn't changed, except for the BRICS, which now seems to be taking a different tack. And I do think that what is actually taking place between the G20 and the BRICS New Development Bank grouping is that the two groupings are in a competition now, given the global geopolitical movements that are taking place. But it will be interesting to see as to whether, I don't think that African countries will be able to make a meaningful contribution on global geopolitical issues that are very unique, such as what you mentioned on North Korea. But I do think that our voice is typically central on the global South issues, such as the call for ending the Ukrainian conflict, such as the call for reforming the global financial architecture, such that it can be more developmental in its approach.
But even around, the issue of this war in Ukraine, there hasn't necessarily been, unity on how the matter must be approached on the African continent. So how important is it going to be for the AU to speak in one voice? Because for as long as we've got all these different, and of course, different countries will have different positions on different issues, but I just imagine how complex that's going to be when we are sitting at this top global forum. So how important is it going to be for us to speak in one voice?
Sure. I think also to be clear, the G20 is not necessarily a voting bloc in the sense of on the multilateral fora. However, it is an important grouping which speaks to the cooperation amongst countries. What I'm seeing actually taking place through the G20 now is that it's actually competing with what China and Russia have to offer. Russia is very heavily involved in terms of military interventions on the continent, and I think the G20 is trying to match that in terms of its response by way of investment, by way of government financial support. And I think that if African countries can play their cards right, they can play off these various groupings and this geopolitical competition to benefit ourselves. I think this is what should be the focus of African Union, I think even far and beyond the collective voting. So although it's not a must that the African Union vote as a bloc, because the G20 is not a voting bloc and more of a cooperative platform, it is important that the African leaders are able to leverage these corporations to benefit what is in our interest and in the interest of the global South.
Okay, let's discuss the issue of resources now. Will African countries need to channel funds towards this forum? I mean, the AU is already struggling to fund itself. You also need some human resource capital, I imagine, for strategic planning. What kind of support is going to be required from the different AU countries?
So I think it's a sliding spectrum in terms of contribution. Anything from hosting the annual summits, which is quite a costly exercise, and it'll be interesting to see where will that be hosted. Given that although politically the headquarters of the African Union are in Ethiopia, when you look at the African regional integration, the financial headquarters are actually in Nigeria. The other thing is, will African countries be able to make a contribution to global initiatives such as debt relief and debt suspension initiatives, when in actual fact, most of the time, they are the recipients of this support? So it's a sliding scale in terms of the resource required to actually participate meaningfully in this grouping. And I don't think that African countries or the African Union will be able to make its contribution there. But I do think within the realm of the discourse and the discussion of issues that are being discussed, such as reforming the global financial architecture and other major important issues, that the African countries will be able to bring, I think, a voice of reason, given that in the current context of the geopolitical tensions, you're either with the West or against the West, and there seems to be no middle ground. And the African leaders, I think, are the only people that have actually called out for the end of the war, and I think this is something that is in everybody's interest. Meanwhile, I think the West versus Russia and China seems to be very belligerent in its approach, as opposed to trying to find a solution or solution-driven. And I think that voice will have a meaningful impact in terms of how geopolitical issues are shaped through the G20 forum.
Seatu Mabiniza, thank you so much for your analysis. Is the Executive Director at Political Economy, Southern Africa.